Thank you again to Christine, Megan, and Jeremy, our panelists, and our MC, Rob Peterson, for joining us today in talking about how to grow your podcast. The Podcast Academy is glad to host this panel, and I am going to go ahead and introduce our wonderful MC, Rob, who has 14 years in the audio industry. Rob's known for his expertise in growth and marketing, sponsorship development, podcast monetization, media buying. Basically, you see the dollar signs, you think of Rob, at least I do. Rob is currently the Director of Marketing Solutions at Disney. Hi, Rob, how you doing? Thanks for being here.
Thank you. So I should have you walk around with me to introduce me on everything.
I will happily do that. Well, take it away, Rob.
Well, thank you, Amanda, and thank you everyone for joining us today. A couple of brief intros for our wonderful panelists here. We have Jeremy Helton, who's the Director of Podcast Marketing at 10% Happier and freelance audience development consultant. We have Christine Ragasa, who's a PR consultant and strategist, and Meggan Ellingboe, who's a podcast marketing and PR consultant. Before we jump into the webinar, on behalf of the panel, Megan would like to address the senseless acts of violence that have happened across the country recently, and we thank you all for giving us a moment to address that as a group.
Hi, good evening or afternoon to you all. Yeah, I think this morning as we're regrouping and just kind of getting our thoughts together about doing this panel, I think a lot of us, probably like many of you, just found it really difficult to even begin the workday and just kind of trying to process what the heck's been happening the last 24 hours, the last week or so. So, we just want to acknowledge and just say our hearts and our minds are, of course, with the families in Uvalde, in Buffalo, the OC, and I guess just sadly beyond, so much more who have been affected by gun violence. We know that we thank you for being here tonight. I know, we all, it can, times like these can feel absolutely silly, or what we do can kind of feel absolutely unimportant. And so, but we're here and we're trying to do our best to be present. But I do want to acknowledge that it can be difficult to kind of continue on business as usual. And, so in that sense, we just, encourage that we can do what we can do, which is let's, commit to taking an action. Let's try to call or write our representatives and urge action now. Let's try to vote for candidates who have courage this fall. And, I think the important thing that maybe that's probably within our control is being podcasters or being part of this medium. And it's a platform to help amplify true information and spread empathy so that maybe we can help change and move minds, one person at a time, one heart at a time. Again, I know that we've all probably found it really difficult today, and it definitely took me a few hours to get through some morning tears to even just kind of answer some emails. So thank you again for being here, and hopefully we can all just commit to using our platforms in a positive, constructive way to help our country and our fellow humans out.
Thank you, Megan. And on behalf of the panel, thank you for sharing that. And thank you all for giving us this platform to talk about it. It's not an easy transition, but again, we are all here to talk about podcast growth. And it is something that's important to a lot of us. And we'll kick it off now. And again, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. We know there's many different time zones and all that stuff. So without further ado, let's jump in. This first question is going to go to Megan. I think there's some confusion, or some people don't necessarily know what the difference is between marketing and PR. So Megan, if you could just kind of give us a brief overview of what the difference between marketing and PR is.
Sure. And I should preface that nobody should ever feel dumb or lame for even asking about it. It is a very common confusion that people, from executives to somebody just out of college, all come into with various definitions. So the most basic way I can describe the difference of marketing and PR is to kind of break down marketing as this overall umbrella that includes PR and advertising. So I kind of break it down as in marketing's PESO, or PESO. PESO, P is for paid, so like the pay tactics you're doing, like buying ads on platforms or on other podcasts. Your earned media is your media relations, or like the publicity aspect of your plan. S is often referred to as your social media. So like whatever social media accounts you have access to or control over, is the S part of PESO. And then your O is for own channels. So anything like It might be your company's website. It might be your own personal blog. It might be newsletters. If you're so lucky to work for a huge organization that happens to own billboards, it might be that own billboard as a channel. So just break down peso is all under the big marketing umbrella mix.
And Christine, did you want to take it from the PR standpoint?
Yeah. So if you ever see a feature story on a podcast show or a podcast host, that in the New York Times or the LA Times or the Star Tribune, or many other outlets, whether it be digital or print, that is PR. We, as publicists, don't pay for those opportunities. We work with reporters to pitch stories. We establish relationships, keep up with the relationships, and figure out what their tastes are, what they've covered in the past, what they might be planning or interested in writing about. So we're, as publicists, on the other end pitching those stories. If you see a podcast roundup in, say, EW, or in Nick Qua's Vulture, usually a publicist is pitching those reporters to get that sort of coverage. So again, these are unpaid opportunities, and publicists generally work with reporters and producers to secure those feature stories or reviews or additional coverage.
That's great. Thank you, Christine and Meggan, for enlightening us on that. And again, to reiterate what Meggan is saying, we're all here to learn. So please ask questions, even if you think it's a silly question. We're all here to learn, and someone else is probably thinking of it. So to the next question, Stephen Davidson from the podcast Looking Back on a Life That Didn't Happen asked, what's a regular mistake people make when trying to promote their podcast? For me personally, it's not having a marketing or publicity strategy in place, especially around the specific launch of a show, or also a special episode that they're doing. So Jeremy, when should podcasters start marketing and publicity? And then Jeremy, if you'd like to go, and then Christine, if you have anything to add to that as well.
Sure. Thanks, Rob. So for me, I think a big mistake is when, like you said, when podcast publishers don't really have a marketing or PR plan or strategy in place before the show or the new season launches. I think that having a finished trailer for your podcast, a finished show description, host bio, and cover art at least 2 months before your launch date, whether that's the launch of a new season or the launch of a new series, I recommend to all of my clients that they really get those assets together at least 2 months in advance. And here's why. Having all of those things, again, a finished trailer, show description, host bio, cover art, will allow you to secure paid ad inventory. It often takes 2 to 3 months to secure ad inventory for specific dates. You need to kind of get it beforehand. It's hard to get it a week before a show launches. It also helps you setting up unpaid cross promotions. Anyone that's going to do a cross promo with you is going to want to hear what they're promoting, and they're also probably going to want to know more about it in terms of more about the host, more about the the subject matter that the show is covering, and also before people can hear a podcast, they're going to see it on their phones, on their computer, and so they're going to want to maybe see the cover art for the show as well. Another thing, another why is because testing the feed on major platforms a couple of months before a show launches. This is for new shows, not so much for shows that have been around and they're just launching a new season. It's really, really important. You shouldn't underestimate how long it can take for a show to pop up on various platforms. I think a lot of times when I've worked with clients, they might see their show pop up on Apple Podcasts or Spotify fairly quickly, but there's a lot of other platforms that your show can be on, and it's really important that you make sure that via a trailer that your show is available on every possible listening platform that's out there. And sometimes it can take a few hours, sometimes it can take a few days, sometimes it can take a couple of weeks to do the rounds and make sure that your show is available on all of those platforms for listeners to find it. And then finally, most requests that one makes of platforms, so this is when you're pitching a platform and requesting that they feature your show, they're going to want to have a link to your show from their platform in that submission form. And so if your show isn't, if a trailer or a teaser isn't available on their platform, then there's no link for you to share when you're making that request. And again, I think if you do these things 2 months in advance, that gives you the time to sort of complete all of those tasks, and also to start doing some of the outreach and the planning that you need to do. One last note, I've had clients that, they ask, oh, but, we kind of want to keep the show a secret until we're ready to launch. And to that, I would say, nobody's looking for your podcast until you start promoting it. So if it pops, there's millions of podcasts on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Stitcher and Amazon Music. So, the only way they're going to know it's there is if you let them know that it's there, and having it up and available on platforms 2 months in advance before you make any announcements. I don't think anyone's, the chances of people stumbling across it on their own are pretty slim.
Yeah. And Christine, speaking of planning and pushing it out there from publicity, what are your thoughts on that?
So sometimes I get clients who will say to me, I'm about to launch a show and I need PR, and their show is launching the following week. I have worked with many clients over the years, and we typically need a 2 to 3 month lead time. I've worked with some clients where I don't have that runway, and it becomes super competitive and super tricky, in that those who think about that 2 to 3 month lead time know that we in publicity are fitting into editorial calendars for the major publications. Many producers are planning ahead and figuring out what their programming is. We also need audio to share with the top podcast reviewers, and we need to allow for time for these reviewers to listen to the podcast episodes, whether they're rough cuts or almost final, almost mastered versions. They know because we tell them whether they're rough cuts or mastered versions. So ideally, we'd love to work with clients 2 to 3 months prior to. It's super challenging if we talk to a client and they're about to launch. I get it. They're sort of knee deep in the production, but it does us a disservice. It does them a disservice. And we're just competing with all the other people who are planning with that sort of runway.
Yeah, and I would also reiterate, like I work for 2 networks for podcasts, and we ran up to the deadline on things and we couldn't promote the stuff that we needed to either. So plan. And speaking of planning, a question that I think we all get is around budget, right? Like how much money do we need? How should they allocate the budget? And what is the single most effective thing I can do to promote my podcast? There's a lot packed into that question, but Meggan, what are your thoughts on budgeting and how people should allocate their money?
It is a lot. It is always the $1 million question. But just quickly piggybacking on what Christine is saying too, I too have had clients where you work with where they've come in with like very little lead time, and the most important thing you can do in that time frame is manage expectations. Be like, sometimes I think all of us here we probably have all been in situations where just things are just kind of beyond our control, and if we don't have that launch time, I think you have to work internally with your teams to just kind of manage the expectations of like what is actually possible, what to actually expect. Just because we know there's a lot of heart and soul that goes into making podcasts. But anyways, budget, yes, budget. You should have one. You should plan for it. Hopefully your budget, allows for you to plan for marketing and PR consultants like us, or to have it, or to be able to have an in-house team. It's in the early days of I shouldn't say in the early days. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, media companies starting podcasts maybe didn't even have an internal PR marketing team. So budget should definitely include being able to have people who can help you plan and execute a plan, and to actually have budget to execute the plan. So I think a few things around that question, whether you're an independent or with a media organization, a larger company, is I was kind of just asking, like, what are your goals? Is your goal a hobby? Maybe if this is your podcast and it's a little bit of a hobby and you just want to test it out, maybe you can work with like $500 or $1,000. But if it's more, but if you're more serious and you want to grow, it might be worth having that conversation. Can you put 5,000? Can you put at least 10,000 towards something to help you be able to allocate your budget accordingly to some different tactics that may help you depending on what your show is and the audience you're trying to reach. I think, yeah, I mean, I think the big question, I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself, but I think the big question is just to make sure you check in with yourself about what you're trying to accomplish with your podcast. Are you trying to reach a certain audience? Is this more of like a lead generator for your business? Is this to complement other podcasts you're producing if you're part of a larger network? Or, I think, and that'll help you kind of tick through like what seems manageable from a money perspective.
Yeah, and then Jeremy, the ultimate question from a lot of people is, what if I don't have a budget?
Right. So, I mean, I think that if you don't have a budget, then the way that I structure my marketing plans for clients is it's based on three things that Meggan mentioned earlier in the call. And that's paid media, it's owned media, and it's earned media. So the moment that you take, and I think the ideal strategy utilizes all three of those things. It engages all three of those things. But if you're unable to do paid media, then really what you're doing is you're saying, I'm going to rely on earned media opportunities, which is mainstream PR, like what Meggan and Christine both do. But it can also be pitching your show and requesting features of platforms. That's a form of earned media. And the owned media is, again, kind of what Meggan outlined earlier. It's your website, it's your social accounts, it's any kind of newsletter or personal professional network that you can leverage to get the word out about the show. My experience is that, both of those are really effective as part of a trifecta. If you're just relying on those two, it can be really, really difficult to sort of grow that audience. And the other thing too is that a lot of times when it comes to owned media, it's not quite as trackable in terms of attribution. So even if it is highly successful for you, it's really hard to know whether it was actually successful for you or not, because there's not something on your analytics dashboard for your hosting platform that shows you that these social media posts drove traffic to your show.
Yeah, I think that's and I would say on top of that, track your campaigns as much as possible. It's very one-to-one. You kind of have to track it on the back end, but it is worth your time to kind of see which levers to pull. But Christine, like people think that sometimes just getting out there and having your face everywhere from a PR perspective kind of can help lead to downloads. Can you walk us through like what getting the word out for podcasters be, and can PR companies just do that for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people think that crafting a press release and sending it out is PR, and that's actually not effective. We have conversations with reporters. The press materials help, but we work closely with the podcast host and the team to figure out what are the stories that are most compelling to share about a podcast show that we as publicists can share with a producer, a reporter, et cetera. So working again with that sort of runway on press materials, whether it's a press release, a Q&A, and figuring out what the storylines are to pitch to whichever outlet, whether it's a broadcast media outlet or a major newspaper publication. We need the team to collaborate on all of that. In addition, we work on media training some of the podcast hosts before they do an interview. They're so knee deep in the production, the making of the show, that they haven't sat down to figure out what is the elevator pitch, what is the 4-minute interview, what does that look like, or what does the 15-minute interview look like? What are potential questions that might be asked during an interview? My team and I work on all of that and prep a podcast host or a producer on what to expect before doing an interview. We always think of it as, you're given that one chance and make it count.
I think that completely makes sense and kind of reinforces everything we've been talking about. Preparation, it leads to as much success as possible. As a follow-up to what levers we can pull, Jason Farr from There It Is podcast had a question about the use of social media in marketing and publicity efforts. They asked, how can I use social media to market my podcast without needing to spend a ton of time thinking about what to post? Honestly, I think for me, the quickest way is to kind of take what you think is the most viral or the most impactful bit of the show that you just recorded and kind of post it to social as an audiogram. There's many tools that you can use to kind of to post that and try and generate some interest and buzz around that. We also had a question about how are you more likely to get support and from engagement from fans on social media? Jeremy, we've had conversations about the use of social media many times about how effective it is. And I know you have kind of two talking points really on the use of it for marketing efforts and the use of it to generate, engagement with fans. So I'd love to hear you share that with the audience here.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the way that I look at social media and even like social media accounts that are specific to podcasts is that people are following those accounts because they already listen to the podcast. So the social media accounts to me aren't really a source of new listeners so much as they are an opportunity to engage existing listeners in a more rich and profound way beyond just them, downloading the episodes every week or what have you. I don't want to completely dismiss social media as a tool for audience development. I think in the event that you have a really high profile guest come on your show, if that person who has a substantial following on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or what have you posts about the show, and more importantly, if they post properly about the show, i.e. if they post when the episode is live as opposed to posting something like had a great time on so-and-so's podcast, but the episode hasn't been published yet. If that high profile guest posts when the episode is live, if they post a link to the episode on the listening platform of choice, and if they tag the account for that podcast that invited them to appear, that to me is an optimal type of promotion that someone with a really a high profile guest could sort of contribute in terms of audience development. But Rob, you and I know from working together in the past on campaigns that even celebrities that get into the podcasting game that have millions of followers on a given social media platform, only a small percentage of those followers are actually going to end up like listening to the podcast because those followers, not all of them may be interested in audio storytelling. And so you can't assume that because someone has a huge following that A, they're going to get the post right, that they're going to do the post that's most helpful to driving traffic to you, or B, that just because they have a lot of followers that a substantial number of those followers are actually even interested in podcasting. We forget that television, streaming, broadcast, books, YouTube, social media, they all have a much larger number of consumers than podcasting still does. So I would just say there seems to be a lot of investment in time and energy in social media. So I would just say, just sort of like be aware of like how it's effective and how it isn't. And this is coming from someone, Rob and I, we've both done paid social media, we've done organic. And I don't think that we've really been able to attribute a great increase in downloads or subscribership based on even effective social media campaigns.
Yeah, and again, I would go back to what I said earlier: is just make sure you're tracking it. I would pause all other campaigns just to kind of test and see what social does, so you can refocus your efforts on things that are channels that are really going to draw that. And maybe social is, but to Jeremy's point, from our past experience, it hasn't been a massive driver. So we've been through a lot already. I think we want to just kind of get like a quick hit from each of you if we can. What are the most effective PR marketing tactics? We've hinted at a couple, but what do you specifically think is the most effective? If we can go with Meggan first, then Jeremy and Christine, that'd be great.
Sure. So I think from a PR perspective, it's getting to know writers. So if you're following along, if you notice who's writing about the subject matter in which your podcast covers, try to find writers that may have touched, or publications that touched on podcasting, see if you can DM them on Twitter or send an email and just try to introduce yourself. It might seem like it's going into a black hole, but it's a one way to get a relationship. It's one way to get a relationship started. That said, I'll let others expand on this quick hit later in our hour. But also knowing, PR alone isn't going to necessarily launch or grow your podcast. It's a very, very nice compliment. But if your budget only allows for PR, try, just kind of figure out like what is the goal. Just figure out what is that audience goal you're trying to use just solely PR for, and to make it, and then make it effective by getting to know the writers who would best be interested in your show, in your content.
Great. Jeremy?
And I would just follow up with what Meggan said in terms of like, knowing who editors and writers are, what Christine said earlier in terms of like knowing what they're interested in. That advice can also be applied to promo swaps, to feed swaps. That can be applied to requesting features on podcast listening platforms and listening apps. It can even be applied to paid media. And what I mean by that is thinking about your content within the context of a larger editorial calendar. Is there a date peg? Is there an observance? Is there a trending topic that your podcast, whether it's the series or a specific episode, could somehow sort of leverage to connect with a larger audience, to make a case for why your show should be featured at the top of a podcast listening app? Really thinking about it, not just in terms of like, feature this because I made it and I love it and I think you should too, but also really coming up with a reasoning for like why this episode should be in front of people right now.
That's great. And Christine, I know you had a really good takeaway earlier, and I think you might want to highlight it now. Can you explain what an elevator pitch is real quick, and then kind of dive into why it's so important?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the things to focus on when you're about to launch is figuring out what your elevator pitch is. So again, distilling your podcast into, it could be even a 2-minute spiel or a 4-minute spiel. Not leading with process, like, oh, I did, how the show came to be, but more thinking about the audience and how you're going to sell the show to that specific audience, I think is really important. If a show is news related and, if it's related to, say, for example, Roe v. Wade, there will be a lot of people talking about that. There are tons of experts who've been covering this topic for many years, figuring out what your competitive advantage is, what your unique perspective is going to be very helpful.
Great. And I think a lot of creators want to get everything out as quickly as possible, but also want to expand. So, perfecting that elevator pitch is great. And to Jeremy and what Jeremy and Meggan were saying before, it's surprising how many people will answer you if you DM them, if you reach out on LinkedIn. They want to hear from you. I think a lot of us, especially me, is like there's some trepidation around reaching out. They want to hear from you, so don't feel bad reaching out. They want to help sincerely. And the worst thing that could happen is they don't answer. So it's really might be a little bit of wasted time, but it's definitely worth it for the times they do answer. So I'd love to Jeremy, you have something?
Actually, Rob, I just wanted to piggyback on something that Christine just said, and also kind of just spotlight some of your genius from a couple of years ago, which is, Rob and I worked on a show that Snooki from the Jersey Shore did launch with Audio Boom, a company that Rob and I both worked at. And the show had been around for a few months and, had done okay. It was doing pretty well, but we were wanting to get another feature for it. And this is an example, again, of like really fitting into an editorial calendar. Sometimes it can be a trending topic like what Christine just described, or sometimes it can be something that happens every single year, which is, guess what, really helpful for planning because it's going to happen and when it's going to happen every year. So Rob did an amazing pitch to Apple Podcasts where he got an additional feature for Snooki's show. What is it called? It's happening with Snooki and Joey. It's happening with Snooki and Joey did a Christmas Christmas episode. My God, it was a depraved X-rated Christmas episode, but still a Christmas episode. And he was able to get it featured on Apple Podcasts, top of page, because they were looking for content that related to that perennial date peg. So just wanted to piggyback and show like the power, even a show that had already been featured, and Rob was able to kind of like find a new way of getting it in front of people and getting attention for the show.
Well, thank you for that, Jeremy. A quick announcement. I am home with 2 young kids, so they might burst to the door at any moment. I apologize in advance. So I want to get to some questions that we had submitted to the registrants, and then I promise we'll get to the Q&As. This is going really fast, and I appreciate all the amazing questions you guys are asking. So there's one from Kira Deenan. I hope I said your name right, Kira. I know we've met before and we work together closely. She's part of the podcast DNA today, and she asked, podcasting can often feel very one-sided. How can podcasters better engage with their audience? I'm going to oversimplify it, but it's honesty, right? Like just pure honesty with your audience. They're there to support you. They're there to be with you. So if it's a matter of saying, hey, I just couldn't get to emails this week, I'm sorry. To leverage your earned media, like Jeremy was saying before, get onto Facebook, get onto Reddit, and just answer their questions, engage with them. That's going to really endear them. Meggan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think maybe this is where the social media kind of come into play. Is maybe it's a little bit of development, but maybe it's more about engagement. So it could be hosting Q&As on your Facebook page or delving into Reddit. I know Maggie Taylor, who works at Pushkin, is a big fan of surveys. I think sometimes getting to know, maybe doing a survey can help you get to know your audience better, and maybe get to know like what they might be interested in hearing about on your show. But I think if you want to get really creative, you could probably even do like a giveaway or something. But I think you can go ahead and get creative. Either, I think, as Rob says, be honest about your bandwidth, and I think you can keep things really simple, or you can get really, really creative and take time doing something kind of out of the box. So I would say do what works for you and try not to stress about it. Try not to stress out about it and make more work for yourself. Like this, like engaging with your audience should be the fun part of this.
Completely agree. So we talked about a lot of ways to grow our audience, but I wanted to point to a question from Eric Williams from, so far, no offense to everybody else, probably the best title I've seen so far, from That's a Gay Ass Podcast. To grow an indie podcast, what growth tactic is the most important to prioritize? Christine, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So I think of indie podcast shows in a few different ways. One version is more of a, say, DIY podcast show. So if Jeremy, Meggan, and I teamed up to work on a show, we have little producing experience. We're trying to work out the kinks at the launch of a show. For this particular show, I would focus more on content and the listening experience to be the best it could be. Another version is more of a produced show, the ones that say Rococo Punch, who invest in storytelling and think about sound and think about character development. The ones that they do, or even I think Christy Gressman, shout out to you here. She is the brain behind the Orbiting Human Circus, also thinks about character development, storytelling, sound, etc. For those kinds of shows, I would prioritize creating a plan 3 months prior to, whether it's fiction or even news, because I think for anything news related, there are many more opportunities, but for fiction shows, I still want that runway because we still have to work with reviewers and producers to listen to the shows, figure out what different angles might be to pitch. But for Eric's show, because I did listen to a few episodes, he launched his podcast in February of 2021. He's 150 episodes in. His show is, focuses on, it's a queer comedy podcast show. He's a comedian. He interviews people like Bowen Yang and other sort of, some high profile, some not so high profile, people about the moments that gayed us and the traumas that bind them. For him, I would say for an interview style show, which is what he does, I would figure out like what might be revelatory to share with the press, that might be different from other podcast shows or other interview shows. I worked on the Broken Record podcast show, which is hosted by Rick Rubin, Malcolm Gladwell, Bruce Headlam, Justin Richmond, and I did episode pitching. And the ones that I was able to garner more hits for, more PR hits, were the ones that had conversations where there was something revealing and different, something that was newsworthy. So even for a high profile show, it's challenging to get episode coverage. So I hope that helps. But I tried to see if Eric was on. I don't know if he is, but hopefully he will listen in after the link is up.
Well, this is a great segue to something I wanted to say earlier. So everyone, I know there was a lot of questions that came in when people registered. We have some Q&As I want to get to. If we didn't answer your question or you want to expand, I'm happy to jump into Slack at any time on the TPA Slack and general questions. So you can DM me there, or you can reach me at robertfpeterson@yahoo.com. I'll put that in the chat as well. One really quick question before we get to the Q&As. Chad from Book Reviews Kill asked, what's the most ads you can put in a podcast episode without affecting listener rate? So Jeremy, real quick, hit you. We'll go to Meggan, then we'll go to Christine, please.
Yeah, well, so, you have 3 opportunities. There's post-roll, mid-roll, and pre-roll. And, sometimes you're going to want to pack a little bit more than just 3 ads into an episode. I would say the length of the episode would influence how many ads that particular, you should sort of maybe put in there. Obviously, if you stand to make, good money by, putting more ads in there, I would consider that. But I do think that for me, if I'm hearing more than 6 ad spots in an episode, I get a little bit turned off by that personally. Every listener has a different threshold. I would also say too that, because I'm not really on the ad sales side, when I think of ad inventory, I think of that in terms of like the ads that you are doing because you're making money by selling a product or service. But I'm also thinking of specific calls to action that might also need to live on that episode. Let's say you're doing a Facebook Live event, like what Meggan was talking about. You want to let your listeners know on your podcast as well that that's happening. So that could also take up some of your ad inventory. And then finally, if you're doing promo swaps with other podcasts, which you should be doing, that also can take up ad inventory. So I think it's really important to plan ahead and really think about, one, how am I using this ad inventory? Is it purely for monetization, or there are other reasons that I'm, promoting something else in the episode? And really try and figure out what the greater need is. Yeah, I hope that's helpful. I think it's highly subjective, really dependent upon the length of the episode, quite frankly.
Yeah, I agree with that. Meggan, thoughts?
Yeah, I think definitely echoing that it's dependent on the length of the episode. Like if you're a 2-hour chat show, you might have opportunities for like 2 mid-roll breaks. I think I quickly caught somebody asked, what is a mid-roll? So with the placements, like the pre-roll often refers to the ad you might hear at the beginning of a show. So maybe there's like a little like, hi, I'm Chad from like Do It the Right Way podcast. And then they might hear a little music and then an ad. That's typically a pre-roll. And mid-roll is literally the middle of your show. There's that nice little like ads coming back into the show. And then the post-roll is simply the end of the show. So like after you might hear, and this podcast has been made by da-da-da-da-da, you might hear an ad. So that's quickly what those terms mean if you didn't know the terminology that's commonly used for that. I think, I personally as a listener, I'm kind of used to hearing a couple of ads per spot. And I think like what Jeremy was saying, I think, and when I work with clients and we're figuring out cross promotions, and I'm trying to work with the ad sales team about what they are trying to place for monetization. It really is about striking the balance of like, did they sell ads for an existing type of media, product? So is it okay to put a cross promotion in this episode, and if we can, is it better to do it in the mid roll or the post roll? So I think just kind of taking into considerations of finding that balance of like, what of monetizing, and then just thinking about like, what are the products that are going to be advertised, whether it's a cross promotion, another type of, TV show or book, or let's say just a simple old athletic green. So I think just kind of take a look at the mix of what you're working with.
And Christine, thoughts?
I agree with both Jeremy and Megan. The one thing that as a listener irks me is when an ad is inserted while a host is talking. So that just, to me, disrupts the experience. But otherwise, I agree with what Jeremy had to say about 6 ads at max.
Yeah, it's definitely length of show, and I would say you're the best use case in that. Go to shows that you like to hear, and then go on the ones that you roll your eyes of because of the ads, like Christine was saying, that literally drop in the middle of a sentence. Try and figure all that out, and then kind of bake it into your show. So Shad, I hope you're here. I know you had more to that question. I personally did a monetization panel recently. You can find that on demand on the TPA website. I know there were some of those questions in the Q&A also. So speaking of the Q&A, this is a great question. I don't know the answer to it, but from Kaylee Monahan, I hope I said that correctly. They've been podcasting for nearly 8 years now, for both fun and professionally. If my show has been ongoing, should they still do a trailer? Does anyone want to jump in on that one? Jeremy, go for it.
I think so. If your show is ongoing and you have an opportunity to sort of divide your show up into seasons, that's a really great opportunity to create a trailer for that upcoming season, especially if you're exploring a specific topic or theme. Not everybody makes that editorial decision. Some people, if they're just doing like an interview show, there's really no breaks in publishing, and they're not really they're interviewing different people every episode. They're not necessarily editing or producing content based on a specific theme or idea. But I do love the idea of seasons because it gives you that opportunity to kind of bring a fresh face to the show. It's also really great just for, requesting features on platforms. If you have a new season, you might still qualify for new and noteworthy, which is, tends to be a really nice boost for shows in terms of listenership. I also think too that, even if it's not necessarily a new season, but it's a series of episodes that you're really excited about, that can be another reason to do a trailer. The advice that I always give my clients and the strategy and plans that I provide for my clients are always based on what their challenges are and what their resources are. So if you go and drive yourself crazy doing a trailer, don't do it. But if you feel like you have the time and you feel like there's something special about this next slate of upcoming episodes, then why not? Why not give it an opportunity to potentially boost listenership by putting something kind of bite-sized and engaging in front of platforms and listeners?
Great.
Can I chime in real quick?
Yeah, please.
I think, and kind of building upon what Jeremy is saying, I think even if you are an ongoing show, even if it's not a trailer, I think just having a refreshed like a 30-second promo can be really handy, especially if you are doing cross promotions, promo swaps with other shows. I think if you're ongoing, it doesn't hurt to highlight, have like a promo clip that just highlights like your latest episodes or your latest guests, especially if you're an interview show. I think, it's definitely worth doing on hand if, as Jeremy says, it doesn't drive you crazy.
Yeah, sometimes just really quickly, I would say maybe if you have something like that sort of encapsulates like what the show is and who some, high profile guests have been. If it's been a year, like why not just re-record it, that same message, but just plug in newer guest names, you know what I mean? Because sometimes people might still have like the names of guests that they had on like 2 years ago, when, they've since, brought in different guests since that time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Christine, I want to put this question to you. This is from an anonymous attendee, but I think it's beneficial for everybody. How do you reach out as a podcaster, not as a PR person, to a writer or editor? Is there etiquette to follow?
Yes. Know what they cover. And even like call attention to some of the stories that person might have written, and why, and you should also highlight why that person, like say Rob Peterson, might be interested in your show.
Right.
The other thing is, a lot of what we do is not one and done. right? If I send an email, I send a pitch with a press release and links to audio, and I don't expect them to respond right away. I might come back to them with other angles or other things to note, a few days or a few weeks later. Again, which is why it's important to collaborate with the podcast teams on PR and marketing with that sort of runway. I would also say don't spam them, right? So, don't say, I haven't heard from you, because they're busy, they're wearing many hats. A lot of podcast reviewers are covering not just nonfiction podcasts, they're covering fiction podcasts. They might be reviewing books. I always consider podcasts, the people who cover podcasts as, the sort of stepsister to, say, someone who might be covering film or books or, TV show launches, etc.
Thank you. That was great, Christine. To the group from Thomas Wright, I don't know who wants to handle this first, but he's just kind of curious about controversy, right? Like, is the old adage, any publicity is good publicity? Does that apply to this? Is that something that you might have a controversial host on, or you might say something controversial, even if it's just not meant to be controversial? What's the panel's take on publicity from that end? Meggan, you want to go first if you have an answer for that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think it needs to be, I think it's always best when you can be proactive with your efforts and your publicity efforts. But on the other hand, we all know that many times, we could be part of an organization that has to be reactive. And I think the important thing is to be able to step back and take time and be able to, like thoughtfully respond. You don't just say the first thing that comes off the top of your head. It's about thinking about like what is the controversy, how can you genuinely, I guess, address the controversy. And and I guess that yeah, I mean, I guess it's better I wish I had like a good like specific example to work with here, but I think yeah, I think this is like a very individualized question to a situation. I wish I could think of something else about it off the top of my head, but I think just be thoughtful. Don't try to react, willy-nilly off the top of your head. It's okay to take your time.
Yeah, and I think that might lead to some interest from people overall, but I wouldn't use that as a tactic from a marketing perspective. Jeremy, looked like you were potentially going to chime in there.
I just was going to say, the thing that's interesting to me about this question, the way that I would kind of reframe it is, it's not necessarily about controversy or non-controversial topics, one or the other. What I think it's about is really understanding what are people interested in. If you understand what your audience is interested in, then you make a better podcast. If you understand what media outlets or podcast platforms are interested in, then you play to their interests. And maybe sometimes you're working, or maybe sometimes you've stumbled across a media outlet or a platform that it's obvious, they're like the TMZ of podcasting. They love controversy or whatever. And I think it's about really just doing your research, like Christine and Meggan have both said already during this call, this meeting, like just sort of knowing, what are people interested in? Do they like that kind of like juicy gossip, controversy kind of stuff? And if I create content that feels like it taps into that or comments on that, then that's who I'm going to go to when I'm pitching my episode for some kind of feature. So I really, I think great question. Like, obviously anyone that's listened to the Joe Rogan Experience knows that controversy can definitely have a great impact. But I think it's arguable whether or not that's getting him new listeners, or if it's just riling up those of us who don't listen to the show on a regular basis. So
I agree. So we're going to take one more from the Q&A. Sincerely, thank you everybody for asking this. We have a tremendous amount of questions. We appreciate it. Again, utilize the general Slack channel for the TPA member group. I think this one's really interesting because I think we've probably all encountered this at certain times. So this is another anonymous, I'm sorry, but I think it's interesting. So this person works on mostly short run narrative series, around 4 to 8 episodes, and they're serialized. What times of the year are best to release this type of content? Are there months or seasons to steer clear from? I know that's a broad question, but I do think it's important to kind of talk about potentially listening trends. Like my opinion would be like, you really have to consider summer. Like a lot of people are out and about, they're not always tuning into their normal routine. So I would love to, Christine, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I've actually worked with podcast hosts to launch a show in July, and we've been able to get PR traction, which often drives people to the show to listen. So, I think that there are very busy times that, if you're competing with other bigger shows, backed by large audio networks, and those times you probably want to steer clear from. So they include September, October, and, maybe April, May. Because again, PR wise, you're competing with those sort of roundups and other feature stories, and then also other show launches or other product launches, whether it's, books, which April, May is one of the busy seasons, or even September, October, where it's super busy with the TV lineup, and film, new films launching and other sort of products. So I would say steer clear from those months if you can't compete, I would say, with the bigger audio companies.
Great. Thank you. Everyone, thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I have a couple minutes before I have to hand it over to Amanda. So before we do that, I'd love for each of our panelists to kind of share a recent success story that I think all of you can kind of learn from, and to kind of get the word out on some of the great work that they've been doing. I'd love to hear what they have to say. So Meggan, if you want to kick that off, it'd be great.
Sure. Sometimes in my role, I'm brought on without like the full picture of where somebody is at, and I can be brought in for at some less ideal times than what we've been talking about here. So I will share that a recent client, kind of realized maybe they weren't as far along in their production as they needed to be, and maybe perhaps like it would just crunch the marketing timeline too much. So they actually decided to push back their timeline. So I think sometimes a success is knowing when you just need to postpone, and that is absolutely okay.
Jeremy, what recent success you want to share?
This first best advice I've heard from Meggan, like amazing, like pick the date that works, don't pick the date just because you decided earlier. So for me, I keep saying over and over again, setting up a marketing plan at least 2 months before a show or a season launches is kind of critical in my experience. So I just want to give a really quick but detailed example of that. More Than a Feeling with Salim Reshamwala, which launched April 19th. It's the latest podcast from 10% Happier, where I work. We were able to get podcast cover art, host bio, show descriptions, finished trailer done by mid-January of this year for a show that launched on April 19th of this year. And what we were able to accomplish with that lead time was 16 promo swaps, 12 email blasts, newsletter promotions to people on our mailing list, 8 paid campaigns across digital platforms, podcast listening apps, and other podcasts, 5 RSS or feed drops with 2 podcasts in our network and 3 podcasts outside our network, and 4 feature requests from podcast platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher, resulting in more than 6 weeks worth of features across those platforms. So by April 19th, by the time that show launched, we were able to secure promotions of some kind from April 19th all the way through July 17th. So I think, again, you give someone like me, Christine, Meggan, 2 or 3 months to sort of lay the groundwork first, and we can get you much better results in terms of placement and promotion.
Yeah, and before I hand it to Christine, who has some great story to share too, that helps with anyone with ad sales, with other promotions you want to do. It's just plan. Christine.
Bravo, Jeremy. You can drop the mic. So what I would say is the majority of the clients that I work with have had to do media training with me, and it makes the world of a difference. And they will attest to that. So having a conversation with each of my clients about what each podcast explores, if there's anything in the show that's being talked about in the news, what makes that podcast host uniquely positioned to talk about a specific topic on broadcast media, in an interview with a New York Times reporter, Wall Street Journal reporter, et cetera. All of that is helpful. And again, the runway is immensely helpful.
Oh, well, on behalf of everyone, thank you all for your great advice today and all your knowledge. It really was great. So I'm going to give you a round of applause right here, and thank you all for your time tonight and taking time out of your day and your night to talk to everyone here. It's very beneficial for everybody. So really appreciate your time. I'm going to hand it back to Amanda for some housekeeping stuff. But again, Christine, Jeremy, and Meggan, thank you so much for doing this tonight.
And thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
My pleasure. It was great. Amanda.
Well, thank you all so much. This was such a great event. Again, another round of virtual applause for Christine, Meggan, and Jeremy, as well as our amazing MC. Let me just fade down this music here again. I like to do that if you're a TPA member. Again, folks, if you have RSVP'd, which you have because you got into the room, you will be emailed a streaming link of this here recording. And also, if you are new to TPA, a 50% off discount code. Look at that. Great marketing right there. Please do join us. As you notice, we are a diverse, caring community of independent and affiliated podcasters across several time zones, which is a lot of fun to navigate when you're planning events. Members attend and present events just like this and gain direct access to folks like these wonderful panelists. So we didn't get to all those meaty questions, but as I put in the chat, you will have access to a 1,000-strong community of people across the spectrum of experience behind and in front of the mic. So please don't sleep on that. We'd love to hear your feedback. So just scroll up in the chat and you'll see the link for our exit survey. Yes, we are data-driven. We as an I, Amanda. And I also just want to thank you again for being part of all of us here, this diverse, wonderful, creative, and caring community. I really hope to see you all soon, and we're going to wish you a great evening, potentially a long weekend. Thank you again for the wonderful opening words, everybody, Meggan, especially, and Jeremy, Christine, and Rob again for all your expertise. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks again.
Thank you.